On January 20th, 1989, George H.W. Bush delivered an inauguration speech that history would remember as the definitive Cold War victory lap.
For the first time in perhaps all history, man does not have to invent a system by which to live. We don't have to talk late into the night about which form of government is better.
Bush's pronouncement was interpreted by some as the ushering in of an era without ideological divisions. With the resounding victory of liberal capitalism over communism, we no longer had to discuss which ideas were best. I can't help but wonder, though, if Bush was inspired by Ned Beatty's legendary monologue in Network.
We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies, Mr. Beale. The world is a business, Mr. Beale.
Which, by the way, is one of my favorite 4 on Letterboxd. Be sure to give me a follow. Link below. Later that year, scholar Francis Fukuyama penned an essay entitled The End of History, claiming that the marriage of free market capitalism and liberal democracy was the final form of humanity's sociocultural evolution. We could look forward to a future where ideological commitment becomes redundant, as liberal capitalism fades into the background as a given, as normative as a fish's relation to water. Despite this, our era is anything but unideological. The political landscape is so polarized that groups don't even share basic understandings of the world, with vastly divergent interpretations of facts, concepts, and values. It's as if we're entrenched in completely different realities, speaking fundamentally different languages, and the term ideology is often invoked to account for this rift in perspective.
Ideology, ideological, ideology, ideologically
is ideology and
ideology.
But what does this word even mean? Well, it's not so simple. Scholar Terry Eagleton identified no less than 16 meanings of the term ideology. The textbook definition is the study of knowledge or ideas, but I think the book Ideals and Ideologies by Dagger and Ball offers the best description of its common colloquial usage. They say ideologies provide a framework for understanding and evaluating socially important issues, offer an action plan to achieve socially significant goals, and provide ideas worthy of self-identification. But in the context of the current political divide, we often hear ideology used as a pejorative, that holding certain ideas means you're delusional or somebody's useful idiot. This sense of the term has roots in the Marxist tradition, where an ideology is seen as a tool of social control wielded by the upper class to justify their dominance. Ideology then must be critically deconstructed to liberate people from the mystifications that keep them subservient. Ideology isn't always negative, though, as having the right ideas can be the key to awakening the working class to their true interests. But it wasn't actually Marx who popularized this meaning of the term. According to Eagleton, it was actually Napoleon who coined the term ideologue to describe enemies of his such as Destutt de Tracy, a pioneering thinker in the realm of ideology studies. He characterized Tracy and his kind as detached dreamers who were so immersed in abstract ideas that they lost touch with reality, even blaming them for his military failures. Napoleon argued that there was something inherently irrational about excessive rationalism, that their discipline was akin to being lost in a psychotic delusion. The successors to Napoleon's position can be found in the right side of the culture war today. Contra the cultural left, who strive to wield their critical faculties to liberate society from structures like patriarchy, colonialism, and capitalism, the right cautions against the hubris of discarding time-honored wisdoms in favor of new ideas, using the Soviet Union as the ultimate cautionary tale. Humans self-directing their destiny invariably leads to disaster, so it's best to choose the status quo over revolution and meaning-making myths over ideological hyper-rationalizations. Traditionally then, ideology refers to ideas about the physical world grounded in reason and logic, rather than metaphysical or religious beliefs. Yet in our current cultural landscape, this distinction seems to be dissolving. For instance, Columbia professor John McWhorter makes the argument that wokeness, or whatever people are calling it now, is essentially a religion, complete with its own moral code, rituals, and orthodoxies. Or Jordan Peterson will often advocate for Christianity as a preferable alternative to wokeness, as if these, quote, belief systems are interchangeable in the roles they play in our lives. I think the most succinct example can be found in a recent podcast featuring Richard Dawkins. One of the key figures of the New Atheist movement, Dawkins was a towering figure in my childhood, especially growing up in the American South during the Bush administration when evangelical Christianity was turning every institution around me Jesus camp crazy. In a conversation with Peter Boghossian, Dawkins confronted what some dub the substitution hypothesis.
The idea that when people give up religion, they turn as an alternative to any old nonsense instead.
The notion that our hearts have a God-shaped hole, and in the absence of a deity, that void is vulnerable to be filled by even more irrational and orthodox beliefs.
As religiosity decreased, deranged woke beliefs increased.
It was strange to watch Dawkins wrestle with the possibility that his crusade for rationality may have inadvertently nurtured a movement with arguably even more irrational dogmas. But what about this idea? Do we have a need to fill a gap in our being with an ideology or a religion that determines our tribal affiliation? Does that mean the irrationality we choose is just a matter of taste? Well, I have a problem with this formulation because it's not a God-shaped hole, nor is it an ideology-shaped hole. It's an authority-shaped hole, and if we don't recognize the difference, we can let some pernicious influences slip right by us. To explain, we're going to, again, dive into the works of my favorite philosopher Slavoj Žižek, and particularly his expansion on the laconian concept of the big other. Essentially, the big other represents a symbolic authority in our lives, an unseen gaze that observes us, shaping and structuring how we think about ourselves and our place in the world. It's not a tangible entity, but rather a set of societal norms, expectations, and rules that guide and constrain our behavior. The big other is crucial in how people are conscripted into an ideology. Žižek illustrates this concept with a scene from the David Lean film A Brief Encounter. The movie follows two lovers, Laura and Alec, engaged in a scandalous affair. Knowing their love is impossible, they decide to end things and grant themselves one final bittersweet farewell. Just as they're about to say their last words to each other, an elderly socialite recognizes Laura and sits down with them. Now, Laura and Alec have to mute their feelings in order to keep up the appearance that this is just a casual chat between acquaintances. In this example, the old woman is the big other. She is the presence that mandates they regulate their behavior in order to be perceived a certain way. Just as the old woman's gaze demands they take on a certain decorum in their interaction, the big other dictates the limits of how we see ourselves and the world around us. Basically, we're always manicuring our actions in the interest of pleasing some perceived other. It's a powerful force, influencing our decisions, shaping our identities, and guiding the narratives we live by. The big other can be a metaphysical idea like God, as the divine gaze sets moral boundaries, dictates codes of conduct, and offers a framework for self-conception and judgment, but it can also be a cultural phenomenon like Stalinism. Žižek talks about how during speeches Stalin would clap along with the people, whereas Hitler would just soak in the applause. That's because in Stalinist Russia, the big other wasn't Stalin, but the greater project of advancing the party's cause, of which Stalin too would pretend to be subject to. Probably my favorite way of illustrating the big other is Žižek's example of canned laughter.
I must be looking pretty good lately.
Yeah, you're the best, baby.
While the traditional interpretation is that canned laughter tells you when to laugh, Žižek claims that, on the contrary, canned laughter laughs for you.
Throw that light on you, you know?
Even if we didn't find it humorous, we still experience the relief of feeling like we took part in a social ritual of enjoyment approved by the cultural standard bearer. We get the approval of the big other without having to do the act. The same logic extends to our beliefs. We don't actually have to believe the things that we claim to, because believing through others who have been duped is sufficient. As he says, belief is always belief in the belief of the other. Like the substitution hypothesis, Žižek's elaboration on the big other can provide a lens to understand how conservative religious orientations and the ideological frameworks of cultural leftism function similarly in that they are structured around an unquestionable symbolic authority, a big other that guides beliefs and actions. For example, he points out the similarities between Christian thought and liberal discourse surrounding climate change.
Others call me Mother Nature.
Nature is often envisioned as harmonious, benevolent, and sacred, something that we have thrown out of balance through our sins. Similar to the way a religious big other dictates a respectful and cautious approach to God that ought not be questioned, cultural left discourse on ecology casts Mother Earth as a revered entity subject to vague sentimental ideas about balance that also ought not be questioned. However, unlike the substitution hypothesis, the big other doesn't just identify our explicit ideas, but our implicit understandings of what's permissible, desirable, or taboo. Whether it's Bush's suggestion that ideological disagreements are a thing of the past, or the notion that Christ is an antidote to woke culture, such views conveniently overlook a more insidious ideology, one that remains hidden when we claim to have transcended ideology: the ideology of consumption and enjoyment. This is where the big other reasserts itself, not as a party ideology or a deity, but as an invisible authority that subtly coerces us to measure our worth and identity based on how much desire we generate, how much we consume, and how much we enjoy. A particularly nauseating example of this unseen ideology can be found in those god-awful TikTok videos where people are interviewed about their bank balances, body counts, or asked to rate themselves.
How much money should your future husband make?
Oh my.
These videos are distilled essences of ideology, setting up superficial benchmarks for self-worth, and subtly endorsing a collective agreement with these standards. They are pure ideological affirmations, as if we're inviting the big other of consumer desire to sit at our table, judge us, and direct our actions. Speaking of ideology as left-wing delusional ideologues versus right-wing religious zealots, completely lets off the hook how the big other of consumer desire dominates our psyches. Oftentimes, when we get depressed, our unhappiness doesn't necessarily stem from unmet desires, but rather from our perceived failure to generate desire in the eyes of the big other. We feel inadequate not because we lack what we want, but because we're not inciting enough envy or admiration in others. We think we know what we desire, but in my opinion, actually getting a grasp on what you desire and not what society desires you desire is a defining challenge for our generation. The point is, we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that it's only our explicit beliefs that guide our behavior, lest we miss out on the underlying currents that also direct our lives. Christians are likely to spend more time trying to impress their friends on Instagram than helping the poor, and woke people are likely more concerned with shaping their personal brand as an altruist than actually doing anything to bring justice to the disenfranchised in the global South. The discourse surrounding ideologies, religions, and God-shaped holes can obscure the more subtle normative influences shaping our behavior. Even the notion of actively choosing an ideology overlooks the pervasive nature of ideology itself. Zizek's favorite film to discuss is the 1988 John Carpenter classic They Live, about the vagrant John Nada who stumbles upon a pair of sunglasses that reveal the world is controlled by elite aliens who keep humans subjugated with hidden ideological messages embedded in the fabric of society. They are essentially critique of ideology sunglasses. Zizek points out that the film's crucial insight is that we need to put the glasses on to see past ideology, rather than the common sci-fi conceit of something pulled over our eyes that blinds us from the truth. They Live gets it right. Our natural state is to be immersed in ideology. It's the air we breathe, and to see beyond it, we need an intervention. My intent here isn't to draw false equivalencies between beliefs. I'm not suggesting that all ideologies are equal in value or impact. Rather, it's to highlight that we need to scrutinize behavior that masquerades as non-ideological, to caution us against unconsciously adopting desires imposed by external forces, and not to hate others who obstruct these illusory self-conceptions. Amidst the fervor of the culture war, it's all too easy to deceive ourselves into thinking that we've transcended ideology, or that by explicitly choosing one, we can protect ourselves from other influences. But in reality, we might just be serving another master, one that thrives on the illusion that our cultural adversaries are our enemies because they limit our enjoyment, they restrict our self-expression, and they stand in the way of our validation in the eyes of the big other. Appreciate you guys watching. If you enjoyed this and want to see more, the best way to keep the channel going is to head to my Ko-fi page and support it financially. If it interests you, you can even sign up for monthly donations now. I know I already mentioned it, but my wife and I are super obsessed with Letterboxd now, so be sure to give me a follow so you can spy on all of my movie watching habits, of which I do a lot. If you want to chat about anything, hit me up on the Discord, follow me on Twitch, subscribe to the channel for more content. Links for all of that are below, and you guys have a happy holidays and an awesome new year. Thanks again for watching, y'all. Peace.